Well, hello and welcome to episode 23 of the EnglishAnyone.com Power Learning Podcast. I'm Drew Badger, the co-founder of EnglishAnyone.com. I'm an author and an English speaking confidence expert, and it is a pleasure to have you with me again today. Today I want to talk about something a little bit different. I try to make each podcast its own kind of thing, its own animal, as we like to say, its own thing. But this episode I wanted to do something actually quite different. I almost decided to make this a Master English Conversation lesson, but I wanted to see what everybody thought of it, and I thought it actually would be helpful for a lot of people to listen to. So what I'd like to do today is something a little bit different. I get lots of questions and emails from students, and I can always tell when I'm getting something from a native speaker versus a non-native speaker by just the way they communicate and the words they use. So even if you aren't a fantastic speaker yet, you still should be working a lot on how you can improve your writing. And a lot of that has to do with word choice. So what I'd like to do today is talk about word choice and talk about a couple of things that, number one, you should stop using when you're having conversations or when you're writing, and also a few things that maybe we can kind of choose a better word to describe something than what we're already doing. This could be words or phrases, and there are lots and lots of these, but I've just picked out 10 of them that I've found in emails that I've received or comments that I've received recently. So we're going to talk about 10 things, and I'll cover each one individually to get you just kind of started a little bit in something that we do in Master English Conversation, which is really getting students to stop using the kinds of things that make you sound like a non-native speaker. And the reason they sound like this, the reason you may sound like this, is because of where you learn your English. And a lot of this is coming from textbooks, and it's the same thing I say over and over and over again, and I will continue to say it until everyone around the world is actually learning the correct English or the native, natural spoken English that we actually use. And even if you're using textbook English, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there are still better ways to communicate in a conversational and more kind of friendly way when you're reading, writing, or I guess maybe not reading, but when you're writing and when you're speaking, obviously, with people. So let's get into that, and we'll see how it goes. So the first thing, again, I want to start with words that you should really stop using. There's no reason to use these. I mean, they have their place if you're working in a very kind of high academic environment, but in a normal conversational email or conversation that you're just having with somebody, it's a really good idea to stop using the following few words. The first one is interlocutor. Interlocutor, or you could say interlocutor. There are different ways of pronouncing it depending on where you're speaking. You'll hear it a little bit differently in the UK versus America, but basically this is just a way of describing someone that you have a conversation with. So you can describe a person as an interlocutor or just a conversation partner. And this is one of those examples when you're trying to take a word that's a bit too complex, a word that a lot of people probably won't know, and using it in a conversational way. So if you're asking people, if I go out on the street and I say, hey, I'm looking for an interlocutor. Now, people might think I'm looking for a way to get into my house because I lost my keys, or it could be the name of a machine or something like that. People have no idea what that is. But if you're looking to just have a conversation with somebody, then just say that. I'm looking for a conversation partner. You don't need to look for an interlocutor. You don't need to look for somebody that's, you just want to have somebody that's, you can have a conversation with. So again, using this, especially in your writing or when you're speaking with someone, it's one of those words that you should stop using. Interlocutor, interlocutor. Again, it's not a bad word, and I mean, it's certainly an impressive word if you can use it, but in English, we say this has a time and a place. So everything has a time and a place. That means everything has an appropriate place or an appropriate time to be used. Interlocutor, interlocutor. The next word is not necessarily bad either, but I'll hear it used frequently when people, especially teachers, these are non-native English teachers that are teaching English, and their English is quite good, but I can still tell from their word choice that they're non-native. And it's because they're using often, again, these words that are maybe a little bit too high level, or just, again, it's not the proper time or the proper place to be using them. And this word is pupil. Pupil. Now, pupil is just another word for student, which is what really you should be using in this situation. Even if you are a college professor, pupil is kind of an older word that people don't really use so much. Again, you can use it, and maybe it would appear more outside of English-speaking countries because more people that are non-native speakers that are teaching the language maybe are continuing to use this word, but especially in an English teaching country, or an English speaking country I should say, if you're a teacher at a university, even people would not really describe students as pupils. They would just say students. And then basically that's really what you should be using instead of that. So if you're thinking about using that in your writing, it's perfectly okay to use that, but it's definitely going to sound a little bit off. It's going to sound a little bit inappropriate. Again, it's not the correct time or place to be using that. Really, pupil, you don't have to use that ever. You can always just use student and people will understand exactly what you're talking about. So instead of using pupil, use student. Student. The next one, and this is an interesting one, this is homemaker. Homemaker. Now, homemaker is kind of an old-fashioned word. People will still understand it, and this refers to women that stay at home to raise children, usually while their husbands are out working. And so a homemaker is just basically a woman, and it could be a man also, but typically to be called a homemaker refers to women. And this is something, again, it's a bit old-fashioned, so you can use it, but it just doesn't sound very modern anymore. And so what you can use in place of homemaker is stay-at-home mom or stay-at-home dad. And this is a much more common thing that you'll hear nowadays. Again, the language is always changing, and that's one of the reasons that I produce Master English Conversation lessons with my team new every month, because there are always new things to learn, and the language is changing. New words are being created, new phrases and expressions all the time. So that's why it's important, whether you're learning with me or learning with another program or not, to constantly be learning new things, just like native speakers are. There are always new movies and new things coming out and new expressions that are important to learn. So homemaker, again, it was something that was used many years ago, but maybe it's not used so much anymore, so I recommend you stop using homemaker, and you can continue to use stay-at-home dad or stay-at-home mom. You can also say housewife, that works just as well, but usually stay at home refers more to somebody that's working at home or actually taking care of the kids. So I could be, I work from home actually. I'm recording this podcast episode right now from my home, and it's something that you could, when I have kids, I don't have any kids yet, but when I do, you could consider me a stay-at-home dad or a work from home dad, work at home dad. So just remember to use those. Don't use homemaker anymore. Don't describe yourself as a homemaker. It sounds old-fashioned. Use stay-at-home mom if you're a woman and stay-at-home dad if you're a father. Next, I want to go into a couple of words that are not necessarily bad, but they're often used in the wrong way. Again, we're talking about what's the correct time and the correct place to be using these things. The first one is facility, and this is often used when ability should be used. I often get emails from people while they're talking about their facility with the language, and they're talking about the facility or their ability to speak. Now, facility, again, it just sounds like one of those more academic words, one of those things that you should not be using in a regular conversation, certainly not a conversational email with people. Now, it's a bit more difficult to change the way you speak because obviously you have to be speaking a bit more quickly. You have to be thinking on the fly. This word or this term, this expression on the fly means to be doing it very quickly. So kind of while you're flying around, you have to be able to make decisions very quickly. So this is to be able to do something on the fly. And when you're fluent, you can easily talk and transition and think about different things while you speak and use the appropriate language for that situation. So instead of using facility when you want to talk about your ability with something, just use ability instead. So I have a strong ability, or my speaking ability is great. I have great Japanese speaking ability or French speaking ability, but I wouldn't talk about my facility with the language. Facility. Facility. The next one, this is an interesting one that I get from students, and this is conquer. Conquer. Like when you think about an army that's conquering another army, or a kingdom that's conquering, and this is when you really talk about to dominate something, to really overwhelm that thing, to destroy that thing. Conquer is it's quite a strong word, and it depends on the situation you want to use it in, but often I hear people that want to talk about kind of conquering their fear. And now this is an appropriate way to use it, but it just doesn't sound very native when you use it that way. So you can talk about conquering your fear, but most of the time we're really talking more about overcoming something. So if people that have a fear about being able to speak, or they're nervous about making mistakes, there's lots of other things, and they want to conquer the language in that way. They want to overcome the problems that they have. So if you have trouble thinking, you have to think about what you're going to say before you say it in your own language. If you often have to translate, or you feel stuck when you speak, you just can't find the right words, you want to overcome those problems, not conquer them. So it's something you want to kind of get past. When you conquer something, you kind of take it over, you control that thing, just like one country conquering another one. So the stronger country that wins, they get to kind of control both of those countries, but you don't really want to conquer a fear in that way. You want to overcome that fear, because after you've finished with that fear, then you can move on to something else. You don't want to stay and control that fear. It's something that you want to move on to. Again, you can conquer a fear, but it's kind of the conquering is just at that point where you beat that fear, where you overcome it. That's why the overcoming is the more important thing, and that's what you should be using in that situation. So instead of conquering something, try overcoming. You'd like to overcome the problems that you'd have. You'd like to defeat them, but really overcoming is the thing you'd like to do. Overcome. Overcome. Next, another interesting word I receive when I'm getting thank you letters from people, they will talk about being indebted to me. Indebted. Now the word debt, D-E-B-T, this means you owe money to somebody, or you owe a favor, or you just owe something, O-W-E. So if I borrow some money from someone, I am in their debt, or I am indebted to that person. Now you can describe, thanking someone and saying, I'm really indebted to what you've done. But again, this is for a kind of like a much higher thing. Like let's say someone saves my baby from dying while, the baby is about to drown in a pool or something like that, and they jump in and save the baby. I am really indebted to that person. That's a very high level of thanking somebody. And maybe if you're becoming a great speaker and you're really, really happy that you can finally speak, I guess you can use it in that way. But a more conversational way, the way a native speaker would use it, is just to say thankful. So instead of being really indebted to someone, you're just thankful. Now, keep in mind, maybe some native speakers might be listening to this podcast episode and they might even disagree with me about a couple of these things. And again, it's not that you can't use these words, it's just that they jump out at people. They jump out at me, especially as a teacher, because I get so many requests and comments and emails from students. So I get lots of information about this, and this is something, it jumps out at me. It really lets me know that that person is a non-native speaker, and what I'd like to do is get more people using more conversational language so that you don't actually have that experience when people are, reading your information or getting into conversations with you. You want to be able to have a smooth conversation, and when you're speaking with people, it can be flowing freely, and you don't have to worry about them wondering what other country you're coming from. Now, as a kind of aside thing that's connected to this is why I really explain to students that it's such an important thing that you master grammar and vocabulary. Obviously, pronunciation is important, but what you really want to do, again, if you're having a conversation with someone, is use the correct and appropriate vocabulary that sounds natural. And then obviously having grammar that's great. You will make mistakes, just like in this conversation or in this podcast episode. I'm sure you can find a few grammar mistakes I've made, and that happens, and that's okay. And you maybe enjoy my pronunciation, and that's fine too. But I'm using appropriate language for this podcast. I'm not trying to give you too complicated of vocabulary, those kind of things that I would maybe use in like a college classroom, something like that. So I really want to make it easy and appropriate, again, the right time and the right place for what you're using. So really, pronunciation is important, but I know a lot of great speakers, and these are friends of mine that are in America and they're American citizens. They've been living there a long time. Maybe they have an accent, but they speak perfectly well, and you can understand exactly what they're speaking, and they really are fluent English speakers. Sometimes you may not be able to get your pronunciation exactly where you want it to be, especially if you don't practice at it. It really takes a lot of time to get from some accents to having a really good native pronunciation if you want to sound like a Native American speaker or a British person, or, and again, even in countries, you will have many different accents and many different pronunciations within a particular country, but the grammar and the vocabulary doesn't really change. So that's something that's easier to pick up. It's something that's easier to learn. And then that's something that's, again, more obvious when people are listening to that in conversations. So when I read these things from students, I can tell, okay, this is not just a person that's sending me a letter. This is a non-native speaker that's using a word. Maybe they learned it and the meaning is a little bit different or not quite appropriate for that situation. The next word is ludicrous. Now, this is a really great word too. It means like really, really ridiculous or silly, something like that. And I'll hear it often from students when they're complaining that they feel nervous or they feel a little bit embarrassed or ashamed when they make mistakes in conversations. So what I'd really like you to understand is that ludicrous is quite a powerful word, and it has a very powerful meaning. When you say something is ludicrous, it means it's really crazy. But, when you just make a grammar mistake in a conversation, I wouldn't really call that ludicrous. I mean, maybe you feel pretty strongly about that. But again, when you're describing that situation to me, if you're sending me an email, you're typing, "Hey, Drew," sometimes in conversations I make a mistake and it's quite ludicrous. I'm like, well, it's probably not ludicrous. It's more strange or weird or uncomfortable. Try to really think about the language that you use, and if you would really learn the actual meanings of the words that you use, it'll be much easier for you to understand what's appropriate. So thinking about a word like ludicrous, like, wow, that's a very powerful thing. Like a really ludicrous situation it's almost so crazy that you can't understand why it's happening. So that's something that's ludicrous. So instead of talking about people thinking you are ludicrous because you make a mistake when you're in a conversation, just think that maybe it's a little bit, you feel a little bit weird about that, or something is a little bit odd or strange. So not ludicrous, but strange. Remember to temper your language. T-E-M-P-E-R. T-E-M-P-E-R. To temper your language, it really means to kind of find the right thing that's appropriate for what you're speaking about, and that's what's really going to help you sound more like a native speaker. The last word in this group of words that maybe aren't quite appropriate or they mean a little bit something different from what you think they do, this is a methodology. Methodology. When you should be using a word like field or discipline. People often explain, well, maybe not so often, but I'll get, occasionally an email from somebody that's talking about wanting to pursue a particular field in school, like they want to study biology or they want to study math or something like that, but in higher education. And they describe wanting to learn different methodologies. Now, a methodology actually means to talk about a way of doing something. Like I have a particular methodology. It's just like a method. So a method or a way of thinking about doing something. So I have methodologies for the way I teach English. I think that people should be learning conversational English with actual conversations as opposed to just learning them in textbooks. So that's part of my teaching and learning methodology. Methodology doesn't refer to a whole field of study as one thing. So you wouldn't talk about science as a methodology. You would talk about particular methodologies in the way that some kind of scientific, studies or things like that are done. So instead of talking about a methodology, something that you want to learn, you would talk about you want to get into a particular field, or you want to get into a particular discipline. So discipline you can also talk about as well as field. And that's just talking about the particular subject that you'd like to study. This is a bit more both field and discipline. These are kind of higher level things you would use in maybe college and above. So if you're a graduate school student and people ask you, or if you're a professional person, they say, what field are you in? And you can talk about, well, I'm in biology or molecular biology, or whatever the field you're in happens to be, or the discipline happens to be. But you wouldn't talk about a methodology to describe the subject. Methodology. And now we've got two more. These are two things that I noticed just about the way people write. I know what I'm doing in this podcast episode is it's a little bit tricky because you can never really say that a word is good or bad. Again, it all depends on the situation. A lot of what really happens to students is they're using whole phrases in ways that shouldn't be used. But really, that's kind of something that's a bit trickier that I didn't want to go into in this podcast episode. I wanted to just kind of explore this idea of reviewing things that you probably shouldn't be using or that you're using in the wrong way. And instead of going into longer phrases, which I'll maybe do on another occasion or in a Master English Conversation lesson, if there's an interest in that, what I'll do is just give you two examples of phrases now that I do get frequently when people are emailing. So these are things you can think about not using or using something different when you're actually having a conversation or sending an email to someone else. The first one is lack of the confidence. Lack of the confidence. People will talk about having a lack of the something often especially confidence. It's a really big thing I talk about and a thing I hear from a lot of students where they're describing how they don't feel confident and they describe a lack of the confidence. Now, this is a common thing. Maybe this is probably a lot more like Spanish speakers or people that you can't, when you talk about like something of something else, like de la something, and this is maybe why it would get a bit more translated into English in that way. But I could describe a lack of the confidence, even though this isn't grammatically correct anyway. We wouldn't talk about lack of the confidence. You can talk about a lack of confidence, which is okay. Or you can just say to lack confidence. So I lack confidence, or I have a lack of confidence. But usually I lack confidence is the more conversational way you would say this. So anytime you have a situation where you're talking about the something of the something else, we usually want to truncate that, and that just means to make it shorter or smaller. So instead of lack of the confidence, which really isn't correct anyway, we'd talk about a lack of confidence or a confidence lack. You are lacking confidence. There are different ways to say this, and it's the same thing if I'm talking about like a spoon of silver or something like that. So I can talk about a spoon that's made of silver, and one way a non-native speaker might say this is a spoon of the silver, and that just means it's a spoon that's made of silver. But if we truncate this and actually say it correctly, you can say spoon of silver, which means it's a spoon made of silver, or a silver spoon. Silver spoon. And often in regular conversations, this is what we do. We change the order of these things. So instead of spoon of silver, we just describe what the thing is. Silver spoon. Silver spoon. So anytime you have a situation where you're using something of the something else, and this is a little bit different than like a glass of milk, because we have two different things. One is the milk and the other is the glass. We're not describing Maybe if it's a maybe a particular cup, like if it's a like Disney glass or something like that, it's a particular glass that we got on a camping trip or something like that. So instead of a glass of the Disney, it'd be a Disney glass because we're describing the same thing. But if I have a let's say I have a blanket or a towel that's made of cotton, we wouldn't say, please give me the towel made of cotton. We would just say, give me the cotton towel, because again, we're describing that one thing. So be careful about that when you're describing just one thing, not two things, but just one thing by itself when you're using of or of the. Of the. And the last one, this is just an interesting little phrase I heard from a student, and I thought I would share it with you now because it just shows it's an interesting way that people think about how they express language. And when you can't know for sure what a native speaker would say, you just try making up your own thing. Now, it may be logically correct, but it's just something that will sound a little bit weird or a little bit funny when you're talking with native speakers. And this one was mind pleasure. Mind pleasure. Now, the context of this is the student was describing, this is something I like to do because it is a mind pleasure. You know, it's something that a native speaker would just describe as fun or for fun. So when I do something without having a particular purpose, like let's say I play basketball on the weekends, but I don't do that as a job, I just do it for fun. For fun. So there's no real purpose for that other than I just find it entertaining. It's entertaining for me. So it's an interesting idea, and this is something I will do sometimes when I don't know exactly what I should say in Japanese. I may try to make up my own kind of phrase, and maybe people will laugh at me and they'll correct me and show me what to do. But, you know, this is just something you have to learn. You have to learn lots of different phrases when you're trying to get fluent in a different language, and the best way to do that is to follow what native speakers are doing. So if you're in the textbook still, if you're listening to those things like CDs that are just dialogues that are fake and they're really slow and it's not the correct kind of natural English that you would hear spoken in a conversation or in a movie or some kind of music, then that's the kind of thing that you need to be studying. Well, I hope this has been an interesting podcast for you. It's certainly a different kind of thing where we're kind of going over specific phrases. I'll put all of them in the description here on YouTube if you're watching it there. So if you're watching this on YouTube or if you're listening to this on EnglishAnyone.com, look in the transcript or just the text that's associated with this, and you'll be able to read all of these words and know exactly what you should be saying instead. And so to review all of those things again, find those in the description. And finally, if you'd like to learn more about how you can actually become a fluent English speaker, a lot of that is just reviewing lots of different situations where people are having actual conversations. Getting fluent really is quite simple, especially if you're able to understand most, if not all, of this podcast. You're already really, really close to becoming fluent. If you can read and write and speak a little bit, really the only thing stopping you is the conversational vocabulary. And the best way to learn that is to actually take little itty-bitty steps as you learn and improve by learning the new phrases and the grammar and all of these things that you need to know to become a fluent speaker. But finally, in the end, having to practice with actual conversational English. And once you have that, you have everything you need to finally become a fluent speaker. So however you study, look for examples of conversational English. This is the best thing you can use to learn with, because it's not like a movie that's been practiced and you've got the actors in the movie that have been practicing. They say the same things over and over again until they get the perfect take or the perfect edit of those things. So find regular conversational English. And if you'd like to learn more about how you can get fluent with Master English Conversation, you can click on the link in this video or in the description below this video if you're watching this on YouTube, and you can learn all about how you can start learning real conversational English in simple, easy steps. And then that's what's really going to help you get fluent incredibly quickly. Have a fantastic day. I'll see you in the next podcast episode, and I look forward to seeing you in Master English Conversation. Have a great day. Bye-bye.